Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy.
Here, can you imagine a place that does not have knowledge of suffering? A place where there's not even a word for it because the inhabitants have forgotten it or they don't need to know it anymore. A place of pure perfection.
I can imagine that, but with great difficulty. It is like trying to think about a million. It takes a lot of brain power. What does the ground look like? What do the people look like? What does the sky look like? What do the clouds and trees look like? It requires much concentration.
Indeed, it does seem to be a lot to keep in mind. I wonder if such a place even really exists in samsara. How would we get there? Is it in samsara or out of it?
These are important questions for understanding such a place. I think that if we can imagine it, it must exist. For example, try to envision a color you have never seen before, or a taste you have never tasted before. It's impossible, right? Therefore, if we can imagine it, it must be real.
That thought is comforting and horrifying in equal measure.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we'll be discussing Pure Land Buddhism. What is Pure Land Buddhism? How does it differ from other schools of Buddhism? How do these differences play out in ritual and practice? We hope you enjoy.
So let's get started. What is Pure Land Buddhism?
Broadly speaking, Pure Land Buddhism is a term referring to those practices, texts, and doctrines within Buddhism regarding pure lands, how to be reborn in them, how to visualize them, and how to come to understand them. Contrary to popular belief, which holds that Zen Buddhism is the most popular type of Buddhism in Japan, Pure Land Buddhism is actually the current most popular type of Buddhism in Japan and is very popular in East Asia at large. To fully understand what's going on here, we ought to discuss the meaning of the term Pure Land, as well as some associated practices which were pivotal in the origins of Pure Land Buddhism. So first, a Pure Land is a realm presided over by a Buddha. There are some important things to note here. Pure Land Buddhism is traceable back to early strata of doctrine in Buddhism, but it becomes increasingly popular as Buddhism travels to East Asia and Mahayana doctrines flourish. That is important to know because this understanding of a Pure Land relies on the existence of multiple Buddhas existing at one time in different places, each with their own lands. And this doctrine of multiple Buddhas is something that we see much more often in the Mahayana tradition than in the earlier traditions or the Theravada tradition. In Sanskrit, this realm that we're referring to is known as a Buddhakakshetra, which translates roughly to a Buddha field or a Buddha realm. And it literally refers to the field of activity for a Buddha. This is where they preach, where they live, where they reach enlightenment and final nirvana, etc. To my knowledge, according to Buddhist cosmology, all realms in the universe are part of a Buddha realm. There's a difference to be noted between the term and the definitions of the term Buddha realm and Pure Land. All Pure Lands are Buddha realms, but not all Buddha realms are Pure Lands. So, a Pure Land is a place where the Buddha has purified the place of suffering and ignorance in some sort of dose-dependent fashion. There are some Pure Lands that have suffering and ignorance, but usually it's reduced considerably, or the difficulty with which a practitioner will purify those things themselves or will come to an understanding of the true nature of reality is somewhat lessened as compared to other Buddha realms, which still have places like hells, still have all the samsaric issues that go on that plague and cause ignorance and really weigh down awakening for all of the characters and all of the inhabitants there. We're currently in the Pure Land of Shakyamuni Buddha, which is known as Jambudpiva. You might see the name Jambudpiva in the sutras whenever we read and discuss those, as we are talking about the ramifications of the Buddha's teachings and the extent of them and the scope of them. You'll often see a phrase that says something like, all of the land in Jambudpiva quaked in response to the Buddha saying something. And that's referring directly to his realm, to the earth, you might call it. There are also other Pure Lands that we'll talk about throughout the episode, But for now, we should introduce the doctrine of Buddha Anusmrti, which is critical to the origins of Pure Land Buddhism as a collection of practices, texts, and rituals. Buddha Anusmrti is contemplation or visualization of the Buddha with the goal of perhaps becoming that Buddha, hearing that Buddha preach, conferring somehow with that Buddha, and creating a karmic connection with the Buddha. We've talked about these types of practices before. For example, the three mysteries of Vajrayana Buddhism deal with breaking down any dualistic distinction that might be believed to exist between the practitioner and the Buddha. If you say the things that the Buddha says, then you become one. If you do the same poses that the Buddha does, then you become the Buddha making those poses. And if you make pictures of the realms where Buddhas exist, those realms become real here. And visualization and contemplation of the Buddha is kind of the same way, in that the goal is to become the Buddha meditating, to become the Buddha visualizing a Pure Land, to really emulate the Buddha's mind if the speech is trying to emulate his speech, and if the body poses are trying to emulate his body, and if the mandala are trying to replicate his realm, etc. All of this is done because it's necessary in Vajrayana and Mahayana Buddhism to create a karmic connection with the Buddha to attain enlightenment. There's a checklist of things that need to be done as a practitioner before you can attain enlightenment, and this is probably one of the most important ones, because two of the things on the list are to be preached to by a Buddha and to hear a prophecy of your Buddhahood from a Buddha. So it's very important that you create this karmic connection through this visualization practice. And as such, this visualization has become a central practice to many types of Buddhism, even others that are not Pure Land, given that it's such an early doctrine and that it arises very early in the tradition of meditation practices in India, which become what we now call Buddhism. But this practice in particular is thought of as having led to the development of Pure Land Buddhism because many of the texts in the Pure Land canon deal centrally with visualization of Amida Buddha and his Pure Land Sukhavati. So this brings us to the final important point that we should mention in understanding Pure Land Buddhism broadly. Pure Land Buddhism emphasizes the importance and significance of Amida Buddha. We've talked about how different sects at different times will emphasize the importance of one Buddha over the other. Zen Buddhism emphasizes the importance of Shakyamuni, and Esoteric Buddhism emphasizes the importance of Vairochana. This sort of thing is pretty common. The reason that Pure Land and Amida are kind of mixed closely together is that Amida is thought of by many scholars to have been a deity originating from Central Asia, and his earliest iconography comes from Pakistan and Afghanistan. And this region is kind of where you see a little bit of overlap between Western Chinese, what is now China at least, maybe call it Eastern Central Asian religious practices and iconography, mixing with Indian practices and iconography, because there's more amenable geography to mixing and matching around in that area. Amida in particular is thought to have developed a bit outside of the doctrine in Buddhism, like I've talked about, and then to have entered it when Buddhism arrived in China. We'll see why in a moment when we discuss the name of Amida. So Amida himself has many, many names that we can list off here, and the reason why he has so many names is because he has this relationship between Central Asia, India, and China. In Japanese, his names are just Amida Butsu, which means Amida Buddha, and Amida Nyorai, which is just kind of like Tathagata, or thus become one. That doesn't clue us into some of this doctrinal difference, but the Chinese names and the Sanskrit names might have a little bit to include there. In Chinese, we have Amituofo, which means Amita and Buddha. Amita is a stem for two different names that have been transliterated from Sanskrit, and this is where things get complicated. In Sanskrit, we have Amitabha and Amitayus. There's a meaning difference between these two names, and then there's a reason why they become used interchangeably. Amitabha means the Buddha of infinite life. This is a very important point and a very interesting name to be given to a Buddha, because in Buddhism, nothing is really infinite, right? So sometimes this is translated as immeasurable life. So it's not permanent forever, but it's just immeasurable. And sometimes it's boundless or limitless life. But sometimes they actually really do just stick with infinite. The other name, Amitayus, means the Buddha of infinite light. So we've talked before about how light plays a significant role in the enlightenment of a Buddha and of people. There's plenty of sutras which start with a very bright light shooting out from between the Buddha's eyes. And there's plenty of sutras where awakening and nirvana are compared to brightening of a light and then a blowing out of a light, like from a candle flame or something like that. So this infinite light thing is very close to Buddhist doctrine when it comes to enlightenment. So this relationship, scholars think, is the result of an influence of like what is now China, Western Chinese Taoism, in the development of Amida doctrine in Central Asia, as it had received Amida doctrine and Buddhist doctrine from northwestern India. So it's kind of a complicated relationship. The infinite light thing makes sense for Indian doctrine, but this infinite life, this Amitabha name, is fascinating to us. Fascinating because, like I said, infinite life is not close to the doctrines of early Buddhism at all. So it's actually a lot closer to Taoism. If you're familiar with Taoism, the doctrines there regard, through practice and understanding and study, one's goal is to reach immortality. So to that end, it's often thought of that Amitabha is possibly a Taoist immortal and a Buddha at the same time, and they've been synthesized into what is now wider Mahayana Buddhist doctrine. Nevertheless, the names are used interchangeably in most cases, and that doesn't really change much about the doctrine. The different names might indicate to scholars when one text was written and where it was written as opposed to another, but whenever you're consuming it, it doesn't really make that much of a difference. So Amida's Pure Land, Sukhavati, is where Pure Land Buddhists in China and Japan are usually trying to be reborn. This is the land that they are trying to visualize, contemplate, understand, and emulate and go to in their next life.
So, I'm having a few questions still regarding the distinctions between samsara, a Buddha realm, and the Pure Land. So, does samsara contain multiple Buddha realms?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because this is where it gets wishy-washy. In Buddhism, there's frequently what my professors call like an unenlightened perspective and an enlightened perspective, which attempts to speak for an enlightened perspective, even if, it's pretty much widely regarded that all of us human beings are not terribly enlightened right now. But the unenlightened perspective, he would say, is to ask something like, where is the Pure Land? And that kind of relies on a duality between here and there, between samsara and something else. And this is something that Mahayana in the later traditions seeks to really truly break down. And so the question of where is the Pure Land is very difficult to answer. Is it beyond the door of death? Is it somewhere we can go in our minds right here and right now? Is it in samsara or is it not? What is the difference between it and nirvana? For example, if there's no suffering there, and there's no aging, illness, and death, then how can we think of that any differently from nirvana? Samsara is marked by suffering and ignorance and the Dharma and awakening in nirvana. And if there's none of that stuff going on, then what actually is it? Where actually is it? So in terms of like Pure Land as a concept, that's something that's debated in Buddhist doctrine for, hundreds of years and is still an ongoing debate. As for a Buddha realm, I can answer that a little bit more strongly because that's the wider category. Remember, all Pure Lands are Buddha realms, but not all Buddha realms are Pure Lands. Samsara is collectively the entire universe and reality, which contains within it infinite Buddha realms, right?
Okay. Yeah, that was the core of my question.
Now, when they're pure, that does displace them a little bit. So we'll talk about that in a later question, but the fact of it being pure is complicated. But nevertheless, infinite Buddha realms in samsara, and some of those Buddha realms happen to be what we might think of as pure. But remember, pure and impure is a duality, which Mahayana seeks to break down and transcend. So it's worth thinking about.
So, for example, the Narakas would still be part of Jambudvipa, or would they be considered a different Buddha realm?
Our Narakas are part of Jambudvipa, but
Okay.
there are other realms which have their own versions of Narakas, which are not part of our Jambudvipa. And our 6 or 10 realms, they're kind of specific to our Jambudvipa. Other Buddha realms might have a different division of the 6 realms or 10 realms. They might not have some of them because there's less suffering there. And all of that is actually dependent on what Buddha presides over that land and how powerful and how awakened that Buddha is, and how they go about creating their realm and their pure land, if they purify it at all. And the final thing that is important to note there is that in Mahayana, when we start to see a lot more of this infinite Buddha realms concept, the idea changes from enlightenment being complete as it is to there being like different levels of enlightenment. So you can reach enlightenment for the very, very first time, but then apparently, contrary to the earlier traditions, you can transcend that level of enlightenment more and more and more times. And then I guess what is regarded as like absolute final total Buddhahood with no remainder is what Shakyamuni ended up with at, the very end of his life. That's all very complicated, and it makes these Pure Lands very complicated too, because that determines different characteristics about them.
Okay, that clarifies my term question, so I have a better idea of what the scope is. So let's get back to the script. How does Pure Land Buddhism differ from other schools?
So as we've just mentioned, Amida is thought of as the primary Buddha in Pure Land Buddhism. He is regarded as the primordial or original Buddha from which all other Buddhas in all of the texts, in all of time, in all of reality have manifested. There's this thought that all Buddhas that have ever existed have had to originate from somewhere, have had to have an origin, and a primordial something that they come from. And like I said before, the esoteric Buddhists think that's Vairocana, Zen Buddhists think that's Shakyamuni. Lots of different perspectives about that. But he's thought of in Pure Land to be that one. He's also the one which the Pure Land Sutras are directed at. There's a group of 3 sutras, one of which we've read and discussed, where Amida and his Pure Land Sukhavati are discussed in great detail. Those are the longer Pure Land Sutra, the shorter Pure Land Sutra, and the Contemplation Sutra. He's also thought of in Pure Land Buddhism as being the one that saves all sentient beings. There's this strong idea of faith in Pure Land Buddhism that's not seen in other types of Buddhism. And there's faith then in his ability to save all sentient beings and rescue them and take them to his Pure Land. And that's something that's pretty unique to Pure Land Buddhism. And the list goes on for some of these differences. But I think that there's no particularly interesting reason for their emphasis of Amida over other Buddhas, except that we have seen this happen before, where a small cult that's devoted to worship of a particular character in the text sort of gets popularized to a wider audience. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. In India and in Central Asia, we have some evidence that there used to be cults that were devoted to worship and practice regarding Amida, specifically like doing Buddha Anushmriti or visualization of Amida. And that's just happened to become very popularized and has entered what we might call the mainstream. So it transformed from being a cult to being very, very mainstream. And possible reasons that scholars have speculated for him entering the mainstream of Chinese and Japanese and Korean Buddhism are, 1, his 48 Bodhisattva vows, 2 of which we will discuss. 2, the nature of his Pure Land, the nature and characteristics and inhabitants of his Pure Land. As for the vows, we've talked before about how every single Buddha makes a number of vows whenever they are bodhisattvas. These vows come in the format, if X is the case when I attain Buddhahood, may I not attain perfect enlightenment. During their bodhisattva careers, they spend their time fulfilling those vows and thus becoming Buddhas, right? So the idea behind these vows is that you have to clear the condition X in order to become a Buddha. And the understanding is that they have become Buddhas. So all of those conditions X have been cleared, and whatever is mentioned in X's place is not the case anymore. In that case, coming to Amida's vows, which are discussed at length in the longer Pure Land Sutra, which we'll read and discuss at some point on this show, are mostly typical. For example, if there is any suffering or ignorance when I reach Buddhahood, may I not become a Buddha. But there are a couple, however, that are very, very different. One of them says, and this is a quote from a translation that I've found, which I'll include in the show notes as a reference. If, when I attain Buddhahood, the sentient beings of the 10 quarters, who, with sincere and an entrusting heart, aspire to be born in my land, and say my name even 10 times, should not be born there, may I not attain the perfect enlightenment. Excluded are those who commit the 5 grave offenses, and those who slander the right Dharma. The 5 grave offenses are things like killing a Buddha, killing one's parents, creating a schism in the community. These are things that, in some earlier traditions, people who did these were never ever going to reach enlightenment or Buddhahood ever, because they're such grave sins that it prevents them from ever having that. But what's interesting about this is that you can just say his name, and that'll get you born into the Pure Land. That's not something that we see in any other Bodhisattva vows. And there's been lots of scholarship and speculation as to why that vow is included with him and not with others. But it has become so emphasized in the Pure Land tradition that it's come to be called the original vow. And in that regard, Pure Land Buddhism has come to emphasize the practice of reciting Amida's name as a practice for reaching enlightenment and reaching his Pure Land. The other important vows are those in the 48 which create his Pure Land, Sukhavati. These vows are pretty typical for other bodhisattvas, and what they do is they create the land of Sukhavati. They establish the ground, the sky, the trees, the people, the Buddhas, the water, the animals, if there's animals, the geography, and they establish the rules for those who can be born there and who can't be born there, and all of the things that are kind of necessary for world building. Those vows are creating a land and leading you in a visualization practice, which mirrors, between the longer Pure Land Sutra, the visualization that came up in our reading discussion of the Contemplation Sutra. So it establishes the different things that you should visualize when you're visualizing the Pure Land, and it also lays out the rules for different levels of birth in that Pure Land. And that's all stuff that we have discussed and read about in detail. And so for more on that, I'll include a link to that episode in the show notes. But moving on to some other points there, I think I should mention some other Buddhas and their Pure Lands. We don't really talk about those that much in our discussion of the Contemplation Sutra, and these are not typically as popular in Pure Land discourse today, but it's important to note them because they have been popular at some times. So I already mentioned Jambudvipa, which is where we are. This land is regarded as being less pure than Sukhavati because there's still suffering. There are sentient beings who are not bodhisattvas here. We have narakas, we have the realm of hell dwellers, hungry ghosts, and animals, and all that. This is because some Buddhists argue it was a teaching tool by Shakyamuni to say you need to know what suffering is in order to know what enlightenment and awakening and non-suffering is. And we won't get too far into that, but that's one of the explanations for why suffering exists in some Pure Lands and in some Buddha realms versus others that don't. For example, in Sukhavati, without a word for suffering, how can someone learn the Dharma? That's a question that we bring up and discuss in our reading and discussion of the Contemplation Sutra. How can they actually learn anything if they don't know, like, the Four Noble Truths, right? Those kinds of things are kind of lost whenever you can't talk about suffering. So in addition to Shakyamuni and Jambudvipa, there's also Akshobhya, or the Medicine Buddha, whose Pure Land is known as Abhirati. This is a personal favorite of mine because it has women and it has mountains, whereas Amida's Pure Land is super flat and has no women. The difference is, however, that you're born as an Arhat here, and not as a Bodhisattva, as you would be in Amida's Pure Land. Another important target for visualization and contemplation is the Tushita heaven, where Maitreya resides. This one is interesting because it's not necessarily actually a Pure Land in the typical sense. We talked about how a Pure Land kind of displaces you from the typical realms of samsara. This one is actually just a heaven. It's just an Asura or Deva realm that exists in the 6 or 10 realms as somewhere that we can be reborn into in the regular cosmology without being displaced and without being this weird stage that's set aside from the typical nirvana samsara dichotomy.
So how do the differences between Pure Land Buddhism and other types play out in ritual and practice?
As I mentioned, because of Amida's 18th vow, or the original vow, one can be born in his Pure Land Sukhavati by saying his name even only 10 times in your life. Thus, many Buddhists have made it a practice to chant the Nenbutsu, as it's known in Japanese, or the Nyanfo in Chinese. This reads in Japanese, Namu Amida Butsu, and in Chinese, Namu Amituofo. This translates to praise be to the Amida Buddha. Recitation of the name is so powerful and so popular that it's thought by some Pure Land Buddhists that you don't have to do anything else to be born in a Pure Land. The other important part of the 18th vow is faith. If someone recognizes the gift of faith given to them by Amida, then the Nenbutsu will say itself through them, and they will attain birth in the Pure Land. For more on that, I'll direct you to the Contemplation Sutra episode. Additionally, visualization practice is extremely important and widespread in Pure Land Buddhism, such that Pure Land Buddhists often spend enormous amounts of time in visualization practice visualizing the body of Amida, his Pure Land, his attendants, the inhabitants there, and this is due in large part to the Contemplation Sutra serving as a visual meditation guide. It's told and laid out in such a way that it is impossible not to visualize the Pure Land because it describes it in such extreme and procedural detail. This relates to Japanese Buddhist practices regarding death and dying as well. Because it has come to be said, especially in Japanese Buddhism, that being born in Amida's Pure Land is the easiest way to become a fully realized bodhisattva, with only one more passing away left before final nirvana, Pure Land doctrine has come to govern a lot of Buddhist death rituals in Japan. Often when somebody is dying, a monk will lead them in recitation of the Nenbutsu and visualization of the Buddha and of the Pure Land. The idea is that if they purify their karma and they have correct mindfulness and they have their mind on Amida and his land at the final moment, they will be welcomed into the Pure Land by him and his attendants. Then, once the person dies, the rest of the family does several series of rituals which are meant to transfer merit to the deceased and further propel them through the intermediary period and into the Pure Land for their next life.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of Pure Land Buddhism. Join us next week where we'll be discussing upaya. What is upaya? What are the different meanings of this word? How do they change over time? We hope to see you there, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening. See you next time. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.